Hello.
Okay, hello everyone. It looks like we're still getting some people trickling in, so I'm going to wait a couple minutes. Mike, who usually kind of runs these meetings, he is away today, so I'll be doing that. I hope everybody can hear me okay. And I always wish there was a dark mode for Google Docs, but I don't think such a thing exists.
Why do you want dark mode for Google Docs? Just because you want dark mode for everything?
Yeah, it's just because like I have a huge vertical monitor here that I usually have the meeting notes on, and I dislike the bright white light in my face. Yeah, I guess TLDR, I do like dark mode for everything.
Fake dark mode.
I guess I want like an invert color mode because it's a document. Mode is like not quite the same thing.
There's probably like a Chrome extension you can find or something, I would imagine.
Sure. Okay, it's 3 after, so we'll get started, but feel free to continue to add things to the agenda as we go, and when we're finished what's on the agenda, we can just talk. So quick welcome for first time attendees. You're not obligated to introduce yourself, but if you'd like to, you can just unmute and do that, or use raise your hand with the emoji reaction or whatever, if you'd like to do that, or anybody who'd like to introduce themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I can introduce myself. So my name is Niklas. I'm an engineer at Spotify, and we've been sort of looking at OpenFeature for some time. And right now we've, basically looking to share some mobile client-side SDK implementations. So yeah, I'm part of the team that also Fabrizio is part of. I believe I saw Nikki here as well and Brian from our end.
Okay, so 4 people from Spotify. Okay, good to meet you all. Yeah, indeed. Okay, yeah, I guess we can go ahead and get started. So first thing on the agenda, besides that, roles for next meeting. Is there any volunteers for Scribe for this meeting? And then as well as next meeting, we need some volunteers. If not, I can go ahead and try and take notes at least when I'm not speaking.
I don't mind doing it today.
Thanks, Pete. Okay, so yeah, so first topic I had, so yeah, client side, I won't name any of the organizations that I know happen to be using it right now, but because I don't think it's probably better to get their permission, but I know that there's at least a few organizations that are using our web SDK in prod, and I think that's great. I mean, I think it's pretty mature. I guess I'm kind of skipping down to the second point, but the small concern I have for that is it's still labeled experimental. And I think the reason it's really still experimental is because there's that spec PR request 171 for static dynamic context that's been out there for a while. And maybe the folks from Spotify could clarify this as well, but I believe they targeted this kind of draft specification with the static dynamic context for their client SDKs as well. Looks like that's the case. So yeah, I really feel that before we can kind of move these things towards 1.0 or even beta, that's something we kind of need to merge so that we can guarantee some amount of stability there. And that's not to say that it needs to be merged in the state it's in now. We can totally make changes, but I think we need to spec out the behavior for sure. So that's really the first thing I wanted to bring up. I don't know if anybody has thoughts on that. If not, the ask would be, especially as we go and review some of the possible contributions from Spotify, that especially if you're a contributor to the spec, go take a look at that PR. The small bummer about the PR is it does cause a lot of thrashing in the numbers, and I made a note about that in my description of the PR. I don't really, I'm not sure how much of a concern that is, to be honest. I mean, the numbers changing doesn't seem to be a huge deal to me, but it can make testing harder. Some SDKs specifically mention numbers in their test suite, so that's a little bit annoying. I'm open to suggestions in terms of changing that. But that seems to be a smaller detail. So would love feedback on that PR. It's linked in our notes, especially any of the folks from Spotify. If you have thoughts on the way that works, that would be helpful and insightful too, since you've implemented some of that. Any questions about that? Any other comments about that point? There's been a lot of activity on that PR. It's quite old. I've tried to kind of resolve any of the open issues. So it just could use some fresh eyes. Okay. I guess, yeah, the next big one is the Spotify SDKs. Kind of like I said, went out of order. So personally, I can review the SDKs from like a spec adherence standpoint. I think it should be fairly straightforward. My only concern personally is I don't have Swift experience or Kotlin experience. I've experienced a lot of other JVM languages, but not Kotlin specifically. So it would be great to have people from orgs, volunteers in general, with familiarity just like with Swift and Kotlin in general and app development, just to review the SDKs.
I can help with Kotlin if needed, but no commitment for beginning of July.
And what are you Todd, you mentioned spec compliance. Is that like the main thing we're looking for here? Is it like, it's mainly that, or is it also just like, what other things should people be? Is there anything else in particular people should be looking at when they're reviewing?
Well, the difficulties with SDKs, like some of the biggest challenges can be concurrency issues in languages where that's relevant. So you want to take a look out for those. I'm not sure. I really haven't looked at them at all yet. But from a spec point of view, eventing is particularly difficult. Kavindu will attest to that, as will Lucas, who's not with us yet. But eventing, especially with multiple providers, is very tricky. So I'm not sure how much of the eventing is implemented because it's very new. But that's a spec concern. Yeah, my main concern is spec adherence, and then just language challenges, especially like concurrency, like I mentioned. Those are really the big ones. We'd also want to make sure that there's no potential spots in the SDKs that could represent painful breaking changes in the future if enhancements are added. So that's another thing that we should keep an eye out for, which again, spotting that sometimes takes some language expertise. So that would be good to have help with.
Yeah, I can help a bit on the Swift side, but not as like detailed or familiar with the spec, obviously, as a lot of you are.
Do we plan to merge this SDK to the OpenFeature org, or is it something that's going to stay in Spotify org?
I can actually, well, we have that question up. Like, so our idea is to like, that's our goal, to get these SDKs basically as full-fledged citizens of the OpenFeature org. So basically transferring them there. I also wanted to sort of point out that we've, like, when developing these SDKs, we've taken some decisions as per, like, if you're familiar with Kotlin coroutines, for example, like these, like certain functions and certain APIs are suspend functions, which means that they need to be called from such a sort of, yeah, such an environment that can support that. And the same goes for some of the Swift APIs that they are sort of await, and which means that they're asynchronous and needs to be called as such. But anyone with some context in those environments would know. Yeah, and we're like, yeah, we're completely up for discussing all of this as well.
For sort of like the promise-based or async-based architecture, like, is that something where you should support both sort of synchronous access and promise-based access? I know with like a lot of our SDKs for DevCycle, like we sort of support both, where it's like you can either sort of like do callback-based architecture, you can do promise-based architecture, because yes, like all modern, obviously Swift and Kotlin and stuff like that is moving towards like async promises, but there's still a lot of folks sort of writing a bit more legacy code as well.
Yeah, and I think like that is exactly the sort of like discussion that we foresaw when taking these decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I might not know enough about the environment to really say, but yeah, and I guess one of the questions there would be, if we were to implement a Kotlin SDK, well, now that we have a Kotlin SDK, and if we were to move it into the org, potentially, what would the candidate providers be, and what APIs would be most compatible with those? So that was definitely something that especially in JavaScript, for instance, we considered. Like, we looked at how many of the backing providers that we foresaw people making, were they asynchronous, right? So I think that could be a potential question. So I don't know what Kotlin providers might be written quickly, I guess is a question. What vendors might be interested in writing providers, that kind of thing, could help shed some light on that question.
If I can add a question there, Todd, so have you had any feedback from the community about the need for mobile SDKs? Do you have an idea who might be interested in developing mobile providers on top of it?
I couldn't specifically name orgs. I mean, one of the challenges with the project, honestly, is that people use the stuff and we don't know when they're using it. We find that people are using stuff in prod basically because they, write a bug, they write an issue, or they write a feature request, or they just say, hey, we're using this in prod, and we just want to let you know. So it's really hard to gather that kind of feedback. It's one of the biggest challenges in the project, especially preemptively before we've released something like a Swift SDK or Kotlin SDK. It's hard to know who might use it and who might be interested. I mean, we've had a lot of people asking about Python. So I don't know. I'm not sure if somebody else on the call knows of somebody who's chomping at the bit to use OpenFeature in a mobile setting. Maybe you can shed some light if that's the case.
For Kotlin SDKs, one question: do you actually see creation of a Kotlin SDK from scratch? Because for me, it would be just a Java SDK binding with some syntax sugar. Or do you actually expect something to be created from scratch for Kotlin?
Well, I think what Spotify is built is completely from scratch in Kotlin, really targeting mobile use cases, right? That's correct?
Correct.
I
Yes.
think the main difference here is like we are supporting the client-side API rather than client-side spec rather than server spec. So this is why it's a different SDK, but it could
Yeah,
be
exactly.
almost the same thing.
Yeah, the Java SDK is entirely targeting server. I mean, I suppose you could use it in the client, but it's really built for server, for a dynamic context, for every single request. It basically assumes, thread per request, and that you're on a server setting and the context is dynamically changing. That would not be the case with the Kotlin SDK. It would target it does target the static dynamic context, or the static context that we've talked about. And I mentioned earlier in the draft spec.
Yeah. So, but yeah, basically, it would make sense to have one JVM focus client SDK. So I just wonder whether it makes sense to prioritize Kotlin in this case, because Kotlin runtime is quite painful. So maybe it would make sense to actually create a pure Java SDK that would just implement client side and make it distributable for all the platforms.
Yeah, for me, that's an open question. I mean, I certainly am not opposed to a pure Kotlin SDK. To be honest, I don't know enough, and I don't do enough Android development to really comment on what would be more generally useful to the community. I'm kind of the opinion, if we have a Kotlin SDK that's pure Kotlin and implements the spec, it makes sense to have it in the org. Because SDK is not easy to write, and I haven't seen anybody volunteer to write a Java SDK for the client.
Can't you call Kotlin code from Java in the Android app? Like, I believe.
Yes. The problem that if you go this way, you have to include Kotlin runtime, and Kotlin runtime is very heavy, and for many users it will be a massive concern in terms of security footprint of the library if you just ship Kotlin. So this is why for libraries it's better to just go with pure Java.
So very similar to the Swift side of it. Like Swift's gotten better over the years with that, but originally how Swift had its own runtime. Yeah. Okay.
I think for prototyping, whatever works. I guess so. In OpenFeature, we don't have much asynchronous content. Otherwise, coroutines would be quite interesting to apply for pure Kotlin SDK. Or maybe somebody who hacks it together, they will show the value for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are valid concerns, and it may be that we want to have a Java, a client-focused Java SDK at some point. But yeah, I kind of agree with, I'm not sure, I guess Pete wrote it. I kind of agree with the policy, like if we have, or with the idea that if we have a Kotlin SDK, we should at least investigate it. I would love to get something out there to help mobile users, because like I said, right now we don't have a lot of things to even offer mobile users. So it may be that we see a lot of adoption and we get a lot of feedback. And if we have people saying, hey, I would love to use OpenFeature without having to include a Kotlin runtime, we can talk about a Java implementation that targets client. That's my feeling, at least.
Just to clarify, I guess I'm definitely not an Android expert either, but some people on the call know more than I would. That the Kotlin implementation that Spotify has, would it work fine with a Java provider or a Java Android app? It's just that it would introduce that runtime requirement, or is there would there be more issues than that?
That's basically it, I believe.
It depends on the implementation. because you can write a Kotlin code which cannot be easily plugged into Java. So for example, if you build everything around coroutines, etc., it's just a pain to integrate with Java. But if it's done properly, there should be no problem to integrate it. So if you accept trade-off of Kotlin runtime, which Android, I guess, is kind of expected, then yeah, it should work.
Yeah, like coroutines, I think would be really nice to have, but I would sort of see that as an addition. Like you should make sure that the base SDK works without coroutines, and then coroutines are kind of like a nice syntax sugar for people who are just developing in Kotlin on top of that. And that's kind of how we've approached it ourselves.
The other question, though, is slightly different than using a Kotlin SDK in a Java client app. What about using a Java provider, plugging a Java provider into a Kotlin SDK? I'm wondering what the differences would be there, or if that would be a concern.
It should work quite well. Again, it depends on your implementation, but yeah, in principle, there is no problem. So within JVM, all languages are quite interchangeable. So unless you strongly depend on some implementations of the runtime, it should work.
Yeah, and I guess that would be up to providers. You could write a provider that would be generally usable, and depending on how you've implemented it, and what APIs it makes use of in the runtime. Okay, that makes sense.
Presumably, if I was a vendor implementing just a feature flagging thing for Android, I would make it so that it would work with Kotlin and Java, because there's got to be people who want it to work with Kotlin and Java. So I would guess that you'd run into less issues on that side, unless there was something in the actual SDK itself that was using something super Kotlin specific, it sounds like. Is there like something we can do? Is there like a specific like follow-up we can do to kind of just like confirm it? Because it would be a bummer if we got all the way to kind of ratifying this and then discovered like, oh, it's just fundamentally this Kotlin thing can't run in a Java app, or can't run without a Kotlin, like a fully Kotlin provider. I guess just
I think you can confirm that like you can run like a Kotlin SDK in a Java app. Like we have example apps that do that.
Yeah,
that I can show you. But yeah, there is that, obviously, as Oleg described, that like the runtime choice, that you have to include that in your app, which can increase your app size and stuff like that.
Yeah,
if you're a Java only app. But I think that's a fine trade-off for where we're at right now.
Yeah, agreed.
And I think that the biggest question is probably like, base it on Kotlin coroutines and suspend functions or not, because that is probably what's going to be the pain if wanting to use it with a Java from a Java app, for example.
Yeah, like if it's all based on coroutines and suspend functions right now, then it's probably not super usable to anyone who's not building a Kotlin specific application. So that's kind of the trade-off.
And so it also means no Ktor if you want to do something reactive, which would be quite handy for a pure server implementation otherwise.
Okay, so I think, I think we're still in preliminary stages here. I think that we've probably gone as far into this discussion as will be productive in this meeting. I think that I will perhaps create an issue somewhere, and I'm not sure where yet. Maybe in like a Kotlin SDK placeholder repo or something like that, and we can kind of capture some of these concerns on GitHub, and then kind of formally start the review process. So I'll decide exactly what the best place to document that is, and then I'll respond in the OpenFeature channel. So that's my takeaway. Just so we can track the review, we can have asynchronous, further asynchronous discussions like this one and that kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, I just want to say, on behalf of all of the OpenFeature community, thanks to Spotify so much for your interest in the project and for going ahead and creating this stuff. That's really great. It's super exciting. Like I said, client side, especially mobile, is very, very new to us. It's untrodden territory. So having somebody with expertise, just like take a stab at it is super awesome. Thanks a lot. Yeah, and if there's no more discussion on that one, if there's no more points, we'll move on to Kavindu's point. So last call on that. Does anybody want to say anything else?
Hey, I've got just one question more than anything else around just the review process overall. I know that a long time back, we talked about having like, oh, maybe this is exactly what Kavindu is going to be asking about, actually, with the there was this Gherkin-based kind of end-to-end tests that were kind of like described the spec. Do we have those for client side, and would they be at all useful for this process of reviewing the Kotlin and the Swift SDKs?
Yes, we have them. The Gherkin suite is currently implemented in all 4 1.0 SDKs. And it's also implemented, the same suite is implemented for the web SDK. So there's nothing to the suite that's like specific to the static versus the dynamic evaluation. It's basically the same suite. So I think, Pete, to answer your question, we could implement those Gherkin tests in a hypothetical Kotlin or Swift provider, SDK. I hope that answers your question. Yeah, and I can add a link to that. They are all using, they assume flag D, and I think that's specifically what Kavindu is going to talk about. But I think they would work theoretically to validate the Swift and Kotlin SDKs we're talking about.
Yeah, so to continue on that point, so right now the Gherkin tests, so basically the Gherkin define the test requirements, and then we use flag D to do the actual end-to-end evaluation. So the problem is, so as soon as you have an SDK, you have to have the provider ready to run those tests. Or basically, in this example, Go SDK provider for flag D to run Go SDK test. So that's like a chicken and egg problem. So you have the SDK, you need to have the provider country flag D ready to run the test. So that's kind of a blocker, because if you are newly developing something, you don't have tests because you don't have the providers built in or provider support. So that's where the question or the concerns come from the end-to-end test strategy. And this was raised by the Python contributors, so James. So if you follow the OpenFeature community thread, so there was some concern around that. So one thing we can do is, of course, continue like this. So basically, we continue to build the SDK, so new implementations of SDK, and wait for providers to adapt and then create the test suite. Or we can switch it to SDK side only. So basically, having a built-in provider, simple built-in provider like in-memory evaluation or environment variable provider. So we can do some end-to-end validation based on that provider implementation. So that's the proposal. So if someone have any other opinion, so I'm open for this, or else we can continue with an offer and discuss more there.
So my concern, I totally see the issue. My concern is that the thing that flag D really gets us in this situation is something capable of doing dynamic evaluation. And by dynamic evaluation, I mean it takes some context. Context is the word that we use, that a lot of other SDKs kind of use the user, or some call it context for, but it's like attributes that are a factor to a differential evaluation or a dynamic evaluation, right? So FlagD can actually take these attributes and then use them to determine intelligently the result of a flag value. The important thing about that when it comes to an end-to-end test suite is that one of the jobs of the SDK is to take the context, however that SDK defines context, and pass it to the provider. The provider usually serializes that in some way, maybe sends it down to the wire, maybe uses it in an evaluation that does locally, but it's still the SDK's job to get that context propagated to the provider correctly. So to really test that in an end-to-end way, you need a backend that is sensitive to context and can actually use that context to evaluate a flag. So FlagD does that obviously in a minimalistic way. Go ahead, Pete.
I mean, it doesn't seem like that would be that hard to do with an in-memory provider. Just like if I was writing this test suite from scratch, I'd just write like a really basic in-memory provider that has like some kind of like magic thing where if the user ID is 5, then it always is true, and if the user ID is 6, it's always false, or whatever. And then
could be
Absolutely.
JSON logic. That should be possible. I mean, like FlagD, we can use JSON logic, but we just need the agreement to do that. And if we do have that, that removes this chicken and egg problem, and also could be easier for new SDK implementation to follow up, because with the SDK, you have this simple inbuilt provider, which is common for all the SDKs, and the testing, E2E testing is now no core dependencies there for FlagD or any other system. So yeah.
I totally agree with both your points. We could easily implement something like that. So I think then the question is, I guess I have 3 thoughts that immediately come to my head when we talk about this. Do we implement the provider you're talking about as a real provider that we publish? That's like a really basic one that uses JSON evaluation. It's all local. It's based on some file. It can easily be used for testing. Do we make it a kind of, it's a very simple mock one that, like Pete says, it just, if the user ID is 5, it returns something, and it's purely useful for testing in our end-to-end test suite? So those are the 2 questions. And then the last point I'd like to make is it's true that we can build this, but it does sort of add a variable to our end-to-end test suite that assumes that provider, that fake provider, is built correctly. Whereas if we use FlagD, it's the same thing across all of the SDKs, right? This one artifact we know works, and we don't have to test. It's already tested, just is done and works everywhere. Those are my 3 thoughts.
Yeah, there's a point there. So provider, as a provider, FlagD is feature complete, or well tested from as an individual component, and it's a single point for all the SDKs. But then we still have that dependency issue, especially the circular dependency issues in Go SDK. So I have seen that, and it's really hard to get rid of. So yeah, but on the other hand, compared to, let's say, mocked provider, having a simple provider built in makes sense. So yeah, so we can argue on both sides. So yeah, what we can do is continue with an offer and then have a discussion there and see the pros and cons and see what path we are choosing here. I think it will help the community in the long run.
Yeah, without belaboring the point too much, I'm just curious, Kavindu and Pete specifically, or anybody else who has a take, do you favor doing like a test double, as Pete is calling it, or more of like a basic but fully functional provider?
Yes. A test double, which is a basic fully functional provider, I would say. I personally, I would, if it was me, I would make something that's flexible enough that the tests can be expressive and not weirdly magical, like, oh, user 5 is this special thing and user 7 is this special thing. I'm not sure I personally would go all the way to what Kavindu is saying with like JSON logic or something like that, because I'm not sure it's necessary. I would not do like a full, completely compliant provider, because there'd probably be like, I don't know, 60%, no, 40% of the code in that provider that's not necessary for this end-to-end test. And And like, unless there was a way, yeah, unless that provider already existed, right? Like if it was the JavaScript, I would consider like making like a fully functional provider that's more for people getting started or for demo purposes. Like we did some of that with the JavaScript SDK, where I kind of put together a full-fledged, like a very basic but full provider, partly because I wanted
like a file-based provider, like
not even files, like memory, just in memory. Yeah, because you don't need the file-based, like in the, that's exactly the kind of thing I'm saying of like, I don't think it's worth doing that for this purpose, because you don't need to do it, and it just makes it more complicated and more, there's a bigger risk that there's a bug in the provider that rather than in the tests. And then yeah. The one thing I would say is like, I would 5,000 times prefer a custom kind of test double than using like a mocking framework to build a provider. That would be something I would say is a bad idea, personally.
Yeah, okay, Kavindu, do you want to maybe make an OFEP then as a takeaway for this? Because it sounds like there's a decent amount of interest.
Exactly. I'll open an OFEP with the concern we are having right now and those proposals, and we can discuss the,
Yeah. Since the mocking framework was mentioned, so I briefly discussed it with a few contributors, but I'm currently building a demo that would include OpenFeature and YMock with gRPC adapter. So if someone is interested, there will be actually some, well, let's say prototype adapter maybe next week, ready for evaluation. So if you want to try it out. But yeah, I'm yet to adjust it to the OFEP dot created, because my idea is to actually use it for generic protocol. And right now I'm using one of the vendors as a proof of concept for that.
Well, yeah, keep us updated. Drop something in the channel when you have something to show.
Well, I got stuck with test containers Rust fixes, so it gets delayed more than I expected. But I just gave up and switched to Golang, so it should be easier.
Thomas, you're next on the list.
Yes, I wanted to talk about the flag evaluation wire provider. So basically, for those who don't know, it's like we wanted to introduce like some generic providers that can communicate with gRPC or RPC-based communication to any flag system backend that is doing remote flag evaluation. And we have an OFEP for this, but we still have like some, like not everyone agree about the need of this one. So that's why I wanted to bring it here and to be sure that we have the opportunity to discuss about it. I think the main use case was for open source projects. So they can like just plug in one provider that is generic enough. So any flag system can just like comply to the RPC-based schema and be able to do flag evaluation without, for open source projects to have to onboard like a lot of custom-made providers or having to prepare a plugin system to have like providers into the open source solution.
So I was asking about this in the Slack. I think the one of the big questions I've got is why, in the context of, in this example of, I think we kind of referred to kind of Jenkins, but obviously it's more than just Jenkins, right? The example of like a platform thing that wants to allow its consumers to configure feature flags in that platform, like internal feature flags in that platform at runtime. Like, why wouldn't they just use FlagD? Like, wouldn't FlagD be like almost exactly the right use case? Because I just don't see a scenario where Jenkins or any other kind of thing would say, like, we want to do this, allow this support for people to configure feature flags, so let's go and build a feature flagging backend. It just doesn't seem, when there's like this native flagged thing built.
Mhm.
Does it exactly?
So, let me clarify the use case. So of course, flagged could be one of the options. But here we are talking not just about open source projects, but rather about adopters of open source projects. So for example, if you run Kubernetes, Tecton, Argo, whatever, in your environment, and you want to use some feature flags supplied by this project, and hence you would like to connect to your feature flag management solution. So Jenkins here is probably a red herring because Jenkins has a plugin engine. So you can easily have SDKs as plugins if you invest some time. But the real deal there is a number of smaller projects that use basically native builds that do not have a plugin framework embedded, like, for example, so Kubernetes has an embedded framework, but the vast majority of CNCF projects actually doesn't have plugin ecosystem.
Yeah.
And the idea is that if they can somehow take a generic SDK and embed it, they could let their users to choose a feature flag provider they want for their use cases. So flagged could be one of the options, but some other people would like to take Go feature flags. Some would take CloudBees, Flagsmith, etc. And for me, it would be important to have basically this choice delegated to the end users of the product. Flagged could act as a bridge, as a kind of poor man's solution.
Yeah. That's I guess, so I always get into trouble when we talk about flagged because I think I always get confused as to what it does. But I thought that one of the things that you could do with flagged is have it plug in a provider into flagged that then lets it talk to another backend. So like it's a kind of like a runtime, like a sidecar adapter. So wouldn't that be? So I guess that's the kind of the architecture. Bit grandiose to call it architecture. That's the architecture I was imagining. Is you've got your Jenkins or whatever that's got OpenFeature SDK and plugged into flagged, and that's baked into the platform. And then it's talking to flagged, and then I'm a consumer of Jenkins that's working in enterprise corp, whatever, and I have my feature flagging solution. I then configure flagged to talk to that feature flagging solution using whatever is the appropriate provider and plug it into flagged, and then it works.
Yeah, it's possible. So the downside of this approach is that you basically have flagged as a proxy. So you need to build a flagged, you need to embed your provider there, and then basically maintain this as a solution. So in theory, if there are open feature providers that already run on premises, for example, a Go feature flag, instead of using flagged as a kind of proxy, you could just connect the Go feature flag directly if there was a unified protocol. Yeah, Thomas?
Yeah. So another thing is also it limits what you can do with your feature flags because you need to have flagged as like you cannot expand more than a feature offered by flagged. So here you have like providers that and send everything to the backend, and you can just do whatever you want. I'm not sure if this is a strong limitation for most of the use cases, but for some it may be like a limitation.
And also, one more point. So regarding the flagged architecture, so basically it doesn't have any UI or anything like that, but it just acts like a proxy and exposes feature flag defined in multiple sources, files, Kubernetes, or HTTP endpoint. Yes, it can act as a proxy, but like Thomas said, it's just a proxy, so you can't directly connect to your end provider through that. So, or you have to support that and build the extensions there and so on. So, yeah.
The other thing that I think is probably material. Well, firstly, I should say plugins using flagged as a proxy right now is not possible. Like it's hypothetically close to possible. You can't do it right now. It could be made to happen with relative ease, assuming that you have providers for Go for the backend vendor in question. But the way I look at this whole proposal, it's very similar to, I think the easiest way to kind of communicate it is like, just like people build OTel metrics endpoints or Prometheus metrics endpoints into their open source apps, right? You could build a flag management protocol into your app, and you would not, and if we actually said this was an open feature standard, not a flag D standard, I feel like it makes it a much more attractive proposition, because flag D is, at the end of the day, it's not really open feature. Flag D is a very basic flag evaluation daemon. It is not the open feature project. I feel like if we were to ratify some kind of protocol, some wire protocol, like, you know, Thomas is proposing, it would be a new direction for the project, but it would also be a new direction for feature flags as a concept. Like, we could just say, here, now you can in your application, in a totally vendor neutral way, given a backend proxy that's compliant to this, basically add any dynamic evaluation you want to your application, as long as it's been baked in there, just like you bake in Prometheus metrics and you bake in OTel metrics or traces, that kind of thing. And I really do think it could be interesting for vendors, for the open source world. But I guess I kind of see some of the concerns, because it's a new direction for the project. I think that's something I kind of want to highlight.
The funny thing is, the first thing I thought was that it might actually be more interesting for the client side, because like if you can create a vendor neutral API for the client side, then you could basically like just have the open feature client side SDK as your interface to you wouldn't need to bundle the sort of the provider's SDK alongside with that. And like the open feature sort of client side SDK could be just the only endpoint, and then you're just plugging in sort of a different endpoint for different providers. So like that was where my brain went first. And for context, we like for our backend SDKs, the dev cycle, we have both a cloud version and a local bucketing version. And most people go towards the local bucketing version, but there are people who use like our API version of our server SDKs for certain use cases, which I can get into if you're interested. But that's kind of what I'm thinking this is, plus sort of like the proxy use case that we're talking about.
I think one of the benefits is for the adoption of the project. It's because like if you are a vendor, you just have to have your server compatible with the open feature like schema, and you don't have to build your provider. So it makes also easier for starting to be, if you're a new vendor, just to be compatible with open feature in a short way, let's say. It's probably not the most efficient one because you don't have local evaluation or whatever, but at least you can check, say, I'm open feature compatible.
I guess I'm super skeptical of that last part, because if I was a feature flagging vendor, I would want whatever I'm like releasing as a kind of blessed kind of product to be like, you know, to work reliably, to be kind of like production grade, whatever. And that means you've got to build all the caching and stuff into the provider. There's no way that you can just assume that every time I need to do a flag evaluation, I can make a network call, right? So now I've got to build at least the caching and probably the rules engine into the open feature SDK.
You'd be surprised the number of people that we have using we use like edge workers for this API, and so like you can get probably 20 millisecond, 10 millisecond response times from like edge workers for this type of use case. And there are a decent number of people who are solely relying, like obviously not super high scale, like all those customers go to local, but for like low to medium scale, it's a much easier entry. It's an easier entry point than having to sort of like bundle a larger.
Totally, I totally believe that for someone consuming feature flags, like I would definitely consider it. But if I'm I think as a vendor, I wouldn't want to release that and put my name on it as like, this is the only way, like this is the way that you use blah using OpenFeature, because it just feels like the experience would be.
As a vendor, you don't have to. So it's basically your choice.
I totally agree. I think all the vendors would choose not to. That's the big concern I have, is that no one's going to like, the vendors are not going to say like, oh yeah, let's implement this wire protocol and get the semantics exactly the same.
It doesn't mean that you have to go like remote every time. Also, we can also build some standard caching thing in a provider that is standard for everyone. So you have like already a caching system that is maybe not the best, but you have one still. So
yeah, I mean, that's like, I feel like where we're eventually going to get to is the same thing that every freaking feature flagging vendor goes through, where they have this conversation. Like, I don't know, Ben, maybe you can relate to this. Like, you start off by saying feature flagging is a pretty straightforward problem. I'm pretty sure we could solve this in a couple of weeks of dev time, and then in like 2 years you're like, oh my gosh, maintaining all of these different providers and making sure that the caching and the rule sets works correctly, like I feel like we're saying like, hey, we could just like, pretty sure we can just solve that problem. And I guess I'm not like super opposed to it, but I think that I worry that we're being a little naive as to what would be involved in making this actually work, and being a bit naive.
I mean, one of the things
I don't think you'd ever get it would be impossible to find a common denominator of rules and things. Like we talked about this a lot internally when we got introduced to the project, and that seems like a non-starter. And don't tell anyone, but we still find, well, don't tell anyone, they're all public. We still find inconsistencies between our rules engines, between our languages. It's really massive can of worms. And then and you start to like, PHP doesn't have shared memory state between requests, and all of a sudden you're dealing with stuff like this rather than like, what you're like so far down a hole of shaving things that it's like you can't see the way out.
My advice would be like, treat it only as an HTTP like interface that people in certain contexts would use. Like, for example, if you're writing like a edge worker, right? Like you might want to have a vendor agnostic like HTTP interface that you can call for feature flag values, right? Like if you're writing, like there's a lot of people sort of adopting that right now, and so like that's a use case where like a vendor agnostic sort of open feature HTTP sort of interface could be very interesting for those. But yeah, I would avoid trying to like bake in a bunch of logic on top of that interface, and just keep it really simple, where it's like you're making a call to this interface, and it's just making basically an HTTP request either to a locally run proxy or a server somewhere to return you values.
I guess like at the end of the day, what I think about is like, if the goal is to allow something like Jenkins someone to run something like Jenkins and talk to their provider of choice, which could be in a bunch of different frameworks, I feel like if we go on this Y protocol thing, then we're back to the N times M thing, where in order to make sure we hit that, we need every vendor to have implemented this wire protocol, right? Like it sounds like what we're saying is, in order for, again, that use case of like, I'm Jenkins and I want to talk to LaunchDarkly, or I want as a user of Jenkins, I want to plug Jenkins into LaunchDarkly. I can only do that if LaunchDarkly has implemented the OpenFeature wire protocol.
Or we have FlagD as a proxy for generic use case.
Yes.
Again, it wouldn't be optimal, but it would be a kind of bridge solution for those who need it.
Yeah. I mean,
but the counterpoint is that it might be easier to get providers to do that than like build out 8 or 10 or however many different providers ultimately you need to cover all the SDKs you're going to have.
Especially considering some providers do already have proxies that you can deploy in your infrastructure, which I mean, I get what you're saying. You don't want to do remote evaluation, but remote evaluation when you're talking about a call to local host potentially is a totally different thing.
Totally.
Or call to something, you know, guaranteed to be in the same virtual data center, whatever it is.
I mean, again, that's why I go back to like, it sounds like FlagD would be great as well. The thing that, I don't know, like, I'm going to say like my last point is that like I kind of feel like this is a very, very niche problem. Like I don't actually think there's anyone, that many people, I'm sure there's someone out there, but I would be surprised if there's that many people out there that are like, I want to do A/B testing on a Jenkins feature as part of running it locally, right? Like,
well, it's not about A/B testing. It's firstly about configuring the product.
Yes,
because
they're configuring.
Almost all big projects, including CNCF ones, already have notion of feature flags, whether it's environment variable, property files, or whatever you take.
Yeah.
So basically, by providing standard interface, we allow people operating these services to connect them to the standard feature flag management systems and their infrastructure. So if they want
dynamically to do dynamic,
can I just add one thing?
I don't think anyone's like, I want to dynamically reconfigure the feature flagging for Jenkins. They just want to like maybe configure it in a YAML file, just like they're doing today. But like, it feels like a solution in search of a problem to me, to be honest.
Just one, I know we're really short on time, but one thing that we haven't really talked about, but this has been a really constant background hum when we've been building Flagsmith, is that product A/B testing folk and engineering folk are quite often different and have different needs. And we've strategically steered pretty much every decision we've made in the engineering direction, just because we wanted to not have to deal with these sorts of problems and requirements that people have. And I feel like I'm wondering whether OpenFeature might be steering itself in, or it might have found itself in the same waters, right? Where there seems to be, it's kind of difficult to get satisfactory answers to both of those groups of people in terms of the requirements they have. Because even like some product and A/B testing teams will be like, at 5 milliseconds isn't good enough, right? Like, I've added latency onto our request, they'll be like, we're not happy with that. Like, so we just go, all right, we're probably not folk for you, and that, well, that's why we wrote the local evaluation on server side. But yeah,
I think that's a good point. I think we got to table this discussion. We can move more of it to the issue. Max has another point, and we have 2 minutes left, so I'll try not to hurry you too much, Max. But go ahead. Sorry, David. It's actually,
I think David's before me. Yeah.
Max.
Yeah, don't worry about it. Mine is just a quick update of the meeting we had last week with Emily. So just to kick off incubation, there aren't any major blockers. The only thing I put in here is there's kind of a bit of inconsistency when it comes to the versioning system. So in one point it says it's required, and then in another place it says it's just a guideline. So that's like just one thing we need to kind of fix. Yeah, other than that, I'm still waiting for the service ticket from the CNCF to get approved to get the space for the due diligence document. But that's pretty much it. Nothing else has happened. Everything else looks good when it comes to contributions and adopters and everything. So ideally, if all the adopters that we have listed or that we uncover from now on respond for the interviews, we could reach incubation by KubeCon North America. Questions, doubts?
That sounds great. KubeCon incubation by KubeCon NA would be huge.
Let's see.
Okay, Max.
Yeah, since we only have a minute left, I think I can express the thought in Slack and just get some feedback there. It's we had a discussion a couple of meetings ago around the Ruby SDK. chatted with Jose briefly in DMs on the CNCF Slack, and he's interested in handing maintainership off, and I would be interested in taking that on from our side. I just have a couple of like project structure questions slash next steps for moving some of the work that JustWorks did on our sorbet aware SDK into the main Ruby SDK. Not sure, we don't have time for discussion, but I'll illuminate some or add more thoughts in Slack after this.
Okay, thanks, Max. Sorry that we've kind of killed your time, but please make a comment in Slack, and if you'd like to, we can put you at the top of next time's meeting if you'd like to go into that with a little bit more detail.
If I have more questions or like feel like we need more discussion time, I'll add an agenda item for next time.
Okay, thanks all. Great meeting, very interesting stuff. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.